Many people assume that silence is a sign of defeat. They believe that when someone stops responding, stops arguing, or stops trying, it means they have lost interest or given up completely. But in the psychology of avoidant attachment, silence can carry a much deeper emotional weight. At times, it becomes more powerful than words, more unsettling than conflict, especially when it comes from a super empath. There comes a turning point in certain relationships where the super empath finally stops over-explaining, stops chasing emotional clarity, and stops trying to repair something that keeps breaking in the same way. On the surface, it looks like withdrawal, but on a psychological level, it completely shifts the emotional structure of the connection. The avoidant partner, who once felt secure in their distance and emotional control, begins to experience something unfamiliar: a quiet loss of influence. Avoidants are generally able to manage emotional intensity. They can tolerate arguments, emotional reactions, even desperate attempts to reconnect. In some strange way, those responses reassure them because they confirm that the other person is still emotionally engaged. Even negative attention still feels like control, still feels like they matter in the emotional space of the other person. But there is one experience that disrupts this entire internal system: when someone who deeply understood them becomes emotionally unavailable without anger, without chaos, and without explanation. That kind of silence is different. It does not shout, it does not accuse, it simply removes access. And internally, that creates confusion instead of closure. One lesser discussed aspect of avoidant psychology is that emotional pursuit often plays a bigger role in their stability than they consciously realize. They may present themselves as independent, self-contained, and unaffected by emotional distance. They may even convince themselves that they do not need closeness. Yet when the emotional bond truly disappears, something shifts internally that they struggle to name. This is why some avoidants reappear after long periods of silence. This is why others suddenly become fixated after acting detached for so long. And this is also why a super empath becomes unforgettable only after they stop giving emotionally without limit. A super empath is not someone who lacks strength. In fact, they are often emotionally resilient, observant, and deeply patient. They are capable of seeing beyond behavior and into emotional wounds. They understand the fear behind avoidance, the hesitation behind distance, and they often give more chances than most people would tolerate because they believe emotional safety and consistency can eventually create change. But over time, something shifts within them as well. Instead of focusing on potential, they begin noticing repetition. Instead of trying to fix emotional distance, they start valuing their own peace. And when that internal shift happens, their energy changes in a way the avoidant immediately senses, even if they refuse to acknowledge it. Avoidants are especially sensitive to this type of quiet withdrawal because it breaks their expected emotional pattern. They are used to intensity, pursuit, or emotional reactions. They are used to clarity through conflict. But calm detachment introduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is exactly what their attachment system struggles to process. From a psychological perspective, avoidant attachment develops as a protective mechanism. Many avoidants learned early in life that emotional vulnerability leads to discomfort, rejection, or loss of control. So they build internal distance as a form of safety. They suppress emotional needs, minimize dependence, and create a sense of self-sufficiency. Yet beneath that structure, there is often a hidden contradiction. Many avoidants deeply desire emotional closeness while simultaneously fearing it. This internal push and pull creates confusion that often carries into adult relationships. This becomes even more intense when they encounter a super empath. Because a super empath has a rare ability to make an avoidant feel understood without forcing emotional exposure too quickly. That experience creates a sense of safety that the avoidant does not easily forget, even if they later try to run from it. And this is where the silence of the super empath becomes psychologically significant. The emotional safety that once felt constant is no longer available. There is no more reassurance waiting in the background. No more emotional regulation provided by another person's presence. At that point, something subtle begins to happen inside the avoidant. Not an outward breakdown, but an internal shift. Thoughts start resurfacing. Memories feel louder. Moments that were once dismissed begin to replay with new meaning. They may not express it, but internally, the mind starts searching for the emotional familiarity that has now disappeared. Avoidants rarely admit this shift because pride and self-protection often override emotional awareness. Instead, they may appear unaffected, but internally, the absence of emotional availability creates a gap that the nervous system registers even if the conscious mind rejects it. There is also a deeper psychological truth at play here. Human beings are often more attached to emotional certainty than emotional intensity. Even if someone acts detached, knowing that another person is still emotionally available in the background creates a sense of stability. When that certainty disappears, it triggers discomfort at a subconscious level. This is why some avoidants only react once the emotional connection is truly gone, not during the relationship itself. The absence becomes more powerful than the presence ever was. In many cases, the super empath does not even realize the impact of their withdrawal. They are not leaving with anger or revenge. They are simply choosing peace. They stop overgiving. They stop trying to prove emotional worth. They step back quietly and begin rebuilding themselves. Ironically, that peaceful exit creates a stronger psychological imprint than emotional confrontation ever could. In this video under Avoidant Decoded, you are going to explore 5 key signs that reveal how a super empath can quietly destabilize an avoidant's sense of emotional control without any direct confrontation. You will understand why emotional detachment leaves a deeper impact than emotional conflict, why silence often triggers delayed emotional reactions, and why some avoidants become mentally fixated only after the empath has fully detached. You will also uncover the hidden emotional patterns avoidants rarely show, even to people closest to them. Some of these insights may feel subtle, while others may be uncomfortable truths about attachment, control, and emotional dependency. Because the reality is this: an avoidant does not always process emotional impact in real time. Often, the deeper emotional shift begins only when the person they once relied on for emotional balance is no longer available. By the end, you will see this dynamic in a completely different way. The silence, the distance, the delayed emotional responses, and the confusion all follow a psychological pattern that is far more complex than it appears on the surface. Welcome to Avoidant Decoded. If you are drawn to deep psychological insights, emotional awareness, and the hidden mechanics of human relationships, subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. And stay until the end, because the final insight reveals the single emotional shift that quietly disrupts an avoidant's sense of control more than anything else ever could. To truly understand why a super empath impacts an avoidant so deeply, it is necessary to first understand how the avoidant ego is structured internally. Avoidants are often misunderstood as emotionally distant people who simply do not feel much. In reality, that is rarely the case. Most of them did not start out emotionally closed off. Instead, they developed emotional distance as a learned form of protection. In many cases, early emotional experiences taught them that vulnerability is not safe. Depending on others too deeply may have led to disappointment, rejection, pressure, or emotional overwhelm. Over time, this creates a survival pattern where emotional expression feels risky. So rather than openly showing what they feel, they learn to manage emotions internally and keep others at a controlled distance. This emotional self-protection gradually becomes part of their identity. They become highly selective about what they reveal. They avoid appearing overly attached. They suppress emotional needs. Even when they deeply care about someone, they often present themselves as calm, detached, or self-sufficient, because emotional control creates a sense of safety. When emotions begin to rise too strongly, avoidants often instinctively withdraw. Not always because the feeling is absent, but because emotional intensity starts to feel overwhelming. In those moments, distance becomes a coping mechanism, not necessarily a lack of care. A central part of this pattern is control. Avoidants tend to feel more grounded when they can regulate the emotional pace of a relationship. They decide when closeness happens. They decide when space is needed. They decide how much vulnerability is acceptable at any given time. This control reduces emotional exposure and gives them the illusion of safety. The less emotionally exposed they are, the safer they feel internally. However, there is another layer to this psychology that is often overlooked: Even though avoidants pull away from emotional closeness, many of them still become emotionally anchored to people who continue to pursue them. Attention, even in small or inconsistent amounts, can act as emotional regulation. Knowing someone still cares creates a quiet sense of reassurance. It feeds the part of their ego that wants to feel significant without having to fully surrender control. This is also why many avoidants build an identity around being hard to read and emotionally unreachable. They prefer to appear independent, unaffected, and difficult to impact emotionally. That image protects them from vulnerability. But at the same time, it creates an internal contradiction. They want connection, but they fear what connection demands. So when someone eventually sees through those emotional defenses, the avoidant experiences something uncomfortable. They feel both seen and exposed at the same time. That dual experience is what makes emotional closeness both attractive and threatening for them. A super empath enters this dynamic in a very different way compared to most people. They do not engage on a surface level. Instead, they read emotional undercurrents. They notice shifts in tone, silence, withdrawal, and unspoken discomfort. Where others see distance, they see emotional context. Because of this awareness, super empaths often become unusually patient with avoidance. They try to understand rather than judge. They give space instead of pressure. They communicate with emotional softness even in moments of confusion. Their intention is not control, but connection. This is why avoidants often feel unusually safe with them in the beginning. The super empath does not force vulnerability. They create emotional room. They reduce conflict instead of escalating it. For an avoidant, this feels rare, almost disarming. Over time, however, something begins to change within the super empath. At first, they continue giving because they believe emotional understanding can eventually heal distance, but patterns start repeating. Mixed signals, emotional inconsistency, withdrawal followed by brief closeness, silence followed by reconnection. Gradually, the super empath begins to see patterns instead of potential. They start realizing that empathy alone cannot fix emotional unavailability, so their behavior shifts. They stop over-explaining. They stop chasing clarity from someone who does not offer it consistently. Their emotional energy becomes more contained, more intentional. They still care, but they no longer abandon themselves in the process. This shift is critical because when the super empath stops overgiving, the avoidant loses the emotional stability they were indirectly relying on. The consistent emotional presence that once felt available in the background begins to fade, and for the first time, the avoidant experiences the emotional emptiness they previously avoided confronting. One of the most destabilizing moments for an avoidant ego is when the super empath stops chasing altogether, not in anger, not through confrontation, but through quiet, emotional withdrawal. This is powerful because many avoidants unconsciously expect pursuit to continue even after they create distance. In their internal model of relationships, they assume, if I pull away, the other person will try harder. If I disconnect, they will reconnect. Over time, this creates emotional predictability, and predictability becomes a form of hidden security. So when the super empath stops reacting in the usual way, that structure collapses. At first, the avoidant may dismiss it. They assume the emotional pattern will return, but as time passes, the silence becomes noticeable. The emotional messages stop, the urgency disappears, the energy shifts, and uncertainty begins to replace control. This is where internal discomfort starts to surface, not as open emotional expression, but as quiet cognitive noise. Thoughts begin to form in fragments. Why are they so calm now? Why are they not reacting? Why does the emotional access feel different? Did I lose their attention completely? Avoidants rarely describe this as fear, but it functions like emotional disorientation. Their system is no longer receiving the feedback it was used to. What makes this even more significant is that the super empath is not acting out of manipulation. They are simply emotionally exhausted. They are no longer willing to chase consistency from inconsistency. They step back to protect their peace, not to provoke a reaction. But that peaceful withdrawal removes the emotional reassurance the avoidant had grown quietly dependent on. The second major shift happens when the super empath becomes consistently emotionally unavailable in return. This change is often gradual, but for the avoidant, it feels immediate. The person who once responded with patience and emotional depth no longer reacts the same way. Their communication becomes shorter, calmer, more measured. Emotional explanations decrease. Attempts to resolve confusion fade. Instead of trying to repair emotional distance, they begin to preserve their own stability. This is unfamiliar territory for the avoidant. They were used to emotional availability being constant. Even during distance, the empath would return with understanding. Now that emotional access feels reduced, less predictable, more controlled. At the same time, the empath stops seeking validation. They no longer wait for reassurance. They no longer chase emotional clarity. This creates a major psychological shift. The empath is no longer emotionally organized around the avoidant, and that changes the entire dynamic. For a long time, the avoidant was the one controlling emotional proximity. They dictated closeness through distance. But now that pattern reverses. They begin to experience emotional uncertainty themselves. They are no longer the one being pursued. They are the one wondering if they still matter. And that shift is often where deeper emotional awareness begins to surface, even if it is never openly expressed. When the empath withdraws emotionally, it places the avoidant in the very state they have spent years trying to avoid, emotional uncertainty without control. What changes first is attention. The avoidant starts noticing what they previously ignored: slower replies, reduced warmth, and the absence of pursuit that once felt guaranteed. As the empath becomes more grounded, the avoidant becomes more internally unsettled. One early sign of this shift is when emotional reactions can no longer be triggered in the usual way. At that point, the emotional structure between them begins to change. For a long time, avoidants rely, often unconsciously, on cycles of emotional unpredictability. They withdraw, return, and repeat distance patterns that still create reactions: concern, questions, frustration, or emotional pursuit. Even negative reactions confirm something for them: that emotional access is still there, that they still matter, and that they still influence the other person. But when the empath changes, that pattern breaks. The avoidant withdraws, but instead of panic or chasing, there is calm. Instead of emotional escalation, there is silence. The usual triggers, breadcrumb messages, inconsistency, sudden distance, no longer produce the same response. Even guilt-based emotional cues lose effect because the empath is no longer revolving around their behavior. This shift is unsettling because many avoidants rely on emotional predictability. On a deeper level, they feel safest when they assume emotional access still exists in the background, even during distance. That quiet assumption creates a sense of control. When it disappears, control weakens. The avoidant can no longer read the empath reliably. Distance no longer guarantees pursuit. Emotional reactions are no longer predictable. The system they depended on stops responding in familiar ways, and that creates internal tension. What makes the empath's change powerful is not anger, but clarity. They are no longer reacting from confusion or emotional pain, but from self-awareness. Instead of trying to fix inconsistency, they begin protecting their peace. That grounded state removes the avoidant's ability to influence the dynamic through distance alone. For many avoidants, discomfort begins here. Beneath the surface, their assumption that emotional access would always remain available is no longer being confirmed. The person they expected to remain emotionally responsive is no longer reacting the same way, or sometimes not reacting at all. Another shift happens when the empath stops seeing the avoidant as emotionally special. Earlier, inconsistency may have been interpreted as depth, mystery, or emotional complexity. Silence felt meaningful, distance felt layered, and unpredictability created intrigue. The avoidant's emotional unavailability can unconsciously become their source of perceived value. But over time, clarity replaces projection. The empath stops romanticizing inconsistency. Disappearing no longer feels mysterious. It becomes recognizable as a pattern. Emotional withdrawal is no longer seen as depth, but repetition. And once it is understood, it loses its emotional grip. At that point, the avoidant also loses the identity they were unconsciously relying on. They are no longer viewed as rare or emotionally complex. They become readable. And being readable removes the advantage of mystery that once created emotional leverage. The next shift appears when the empath reaches peace without closure. There is no confrontation, no final explanation, just quiet acceptance. The need to decode inconsistency fades. Emotional energy is no longer invested in trying to understand what was never made clear. Avoidant dynamics often rely on unfinished emotional loops, silence that still feels active, distance that still feels connected. But when the empath heals, that loop closes internally. Their focus turns inward. Peace becomes more important than answers. Growth becomes more important than closure, and emotional investment in unpredictability disappears. As this happens, the avoidant slowly realizes their absence no longer creates emotional reaction. No chasing, no dependency, no emotional tension holding the connection in place. This challenges a deep assumption. That distance still creates influence. That silence still holds emotional weight. That inconsistency still keeps someone attached. But now it doesn't. The empath is no longer waiting. They are no longer emotionally anchored to unpredictability. They are no longer seeking resolution from someone who never offered consistency. Instead, they build emotional independence that does not require the avoidant at all. And that is where the shift becomes unavoidable. After this, emotional processing begins on the avoidant side, often delayed. Avoidants tend to suppress feelings in real time, but what is suppressed does not disappear. It resurfaces later when avoidance is no longer active. Subtle regret begins to form, not always as guilt, but as recognition. Moments that were once dismissed return with weight. Thoughts replay, conversations are re-evaluated, silence starts to feel different in hindsight, emotional confusion increases. On the surface, nothing dramatic has changed, but internally, certainty weakens. Because avoidants rarely express this outwardly, it turns inward into overthinking and mental repetition. The mind circles the same moments, trying to understand what shifted. But the real shift is not external, it is psychological. The dynamic does not collapse through conflict, it shifts through self-respect. The empath stops abandoning themselves for inconsistency. They stop chasing clarity that never comes. They stop overgiving to something unstable. And in that decision, the emotional structure dissolves. The feedback loop breaks. The patterns stop producing predictable responses. And control through distance no longer works. This is where ego weakens quietly. Not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. The avoidant is no longer the center of emotional response. And when emotional absence no longer creates emotional dependence, distance stops feeling like power. It starts feeling like loss. In the end, the entire dynamic between a super empath and an avoidant is not really about winning, losing, or emotional control. It is about what happens when emotional patterns stop repeating the way they used to. For a long time, the avoidant feels safe in distance because distance gives them structure. It allows them to regulate closeness, avoid vulnerability, and maintain a sense of control over emotional exposure. Even when they pull away, there is often still an invisible reassurance in the background, someone still caring, still reacting, still emotionally available. But the moment a super empath changes, that structure begins to dissolve. When the empath stops overgiving, stops chasing, and stops emotionally revolving around inconsistency, something fundamental shifts. The avoidant is no longer interacting with emotional reactions they can predict or influence. The usual cycle breaks. Silence no longer guarantees pursuit, distance no longer guarantees attention, and emotional unpredictability no longer produces emotional chaos in the other person. What replaces it is calmness, clarity, and self-respect. And that is where the real shift happens, not in confrontation, but in emotional withdrawal that is grounded and peaceful. The super empath does not leave in anger. They leave in awareness. They stop abandoning themselves for connection that was never consistent. This is what makes the impact so powerful, because avoidants are not only reacting to loss of a person, they are reacting to loss of emotional certainty. The unspoken assumption that emotional access would always remain available begins to collapse. And without that assumption, their usual sense of control becomes unstable. At the same time, something quieter unfolds internally. Thoughts return, patterns replay. Silence feels heavier than before. Not because of what is being done to them, but because what used to work no longer works. Meanwhile, the super empath moves into a different state entirely. They are no longer stuck in emotional pursuit. They are no longer trying to decode inconsistency. They are no longer measuring their worth through someone else's availability. Their focus shifts inward toward peace, clarity, and emotional independence. And in that shift, the entire dynamic changes form. What once felt like emotional control through distance becomes emotional irrelevance. What once felt like power through unpredictability becomes a pattern that no longer produces the same effect. In simple terms, the connection does not end through conflict. It ends through awareness. The super empath stops overgiving. The avoidant loses emotional predictability. And the space between them is no longer filled with chasing, confusion, or reaction, but with silence that no longer demands a response. That is where the real conclusion lies. Not in heartbreak, not in revenge, but in emotional self-respect, finally becoming stronger than emotional attachment.